sorts out in there in anime. A couple examples. Ichigo. Cloud. And Baka. Some people are compensating more than others. But yeah. Is this plausible?
No.
What do we do?
There we go. A little bit better that time. The problem with this is this thing called torque. It's basically a measure of how twisty something is getting. If you try to swing that, will it twist you back and rip your arm out of your socket? Maybe. So let's put some numbers on this. A typical 5.5-foot sword, which is claymore, used like 12th to 14th century. They weigh 5 to 7 pounds, but they're about this wide. So scaling the same size up to an anime sword, I'm going to estimate those things are at least 30 pounds. Transferring that to kilograms, just because that's the units I deal with, 13.6 kilograms. The other problem is that a real good sword will have this big, huge metal ball on the end called a pommel. These bring the center of weight back down, and what you'll notice up there in the equation I have is that the torque equals the force times the distance being from the axis to the center of mass. So what you want is the center of mass closest to your axis, being your shoulder or your wrist, wherever you're pivoting from, to reduce the torque as much as possible so you can swing it the best you can. If you haven't paid attention to the ends of anime swords, they're sticks. The center of mass is like halfway up the blade. For a 2-meter sword, one about 6 feet, you can estimate it's at least a meter down the blade. So I estimate 1 meter for the blade. I also estimate that you're going to be using your shoulders, your point of axis, so you got about 0.7 meters for your arm. So the total distance from the axis, your shoulder, to the center of mass is going to be about 1.7 meters, and that's what I did for all these calculations. So I go through the math. In just holding that sword straight out, the only acceleration for the other parameter in that equation is going to be gravity. So that's 9.8 meters per second squared. Going through the math, that means you're going to get 133 newton meters of torque. What does that mean? It basically means you would be having to hold a 73-pound person at your fist off the ground. Yeah, that would suck. I've seen parents hold little kids up that are probably about that way, but they usually do it like right here. And since it's closer to the axis, it's a lot less torque. But on your fist, not happening. But that's just holding it straight. What if you want to swing that thing? So I went through some other math, figure out how fast I would have to travel to hit someone at a good speed, figure out the arc, the acceleration. Instead of going and trying to do an acceleration of 9.8 meters a second, you'd probably have to do about 30. So I went through the math again, and the equivalent of that is trying to hold a 220-pound person on your fist off the ground. Yeah, about 8. I don't know anyone that could do that. So, giant swords, busted. I didn't mention it earlier, but I really don't like the title of this panel. I originally named it Science of Anime because I was feeling lazy at the time, and I'm like, oh, there's those shows like on the Discovery Channel. Like the Science of Batman, Science of Star Wars, Science of Star Trek, and I was trying to steal their cred. And then after thinking about it for a while, those shows all like take a phenomenon in the series they're talking about and try to rationalize it with science. But you can't rationalize lightsabers. I'm sorry, you shouldn't. They take it, they kind of do science, and then go way beyond the bounds of where real science is and right back into fiction. So those really shouldn't be called science of anything. So I ended up not liking those shows, and since I'm not pushing it back into the fiction world, I'm just stopping it. No, this is stupid. With real science, I don't like stealing back credit, which is wrong. I really wish I would have titled this panel Anime Mythbusters. Alright, so that's been busted. That's why I keep saying busted. Alright, another example. This one is not so much things that you may remember or even stood out to you, but it sure stood out to me. Cowboy Bebop. There's this episode where they go to Venus. Is it playing or is that just, yeah. They go to Venus, and as they're landing, the stewardess says something to the effect of, oh, you might get sick because there's these little spores in the atmosphere that were used to help terraform the planet. That was what was on the video, and I was just stealing the subtitles, really. These are examples of these little floating spore colonies that are in the atmosphere. Basically what they're trying to do is, Venus's atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide. That's not good for humans. So again, these are the spore colonies, they just float up there. We can't breathe carbon dioxide. We want oxygen. But carbon dioxide is, stuck in chemistry, carbon and oxygen. We want to get the oxygen off and hide the carbon somewhere. So how could we do that? The idea that they have here is putting some kind of plant or thing up in the upper atmosphere of Venus and using that to somehow break apart the carbon and oxygen, bind the carbon into an organic molecule, and leave the oxygen free. Is that plausible?
No.
What sort of idiot would come up with that?
What sort of idiot would come up with that?
There we go. This idiot. For those of you that just failed Famous People 101, that's Carl Sagan. If you don't know who he is, I bet your parents do. He was one of the most famous astronomers in the late 1900s. So like
Made billions and billions of
he had a series, I see the old people know who this is. He had a series called The Cosmos, which is the first really big televised series that brought astronomy to the general public. So huge figure in astronomy. I think he was knighted in Britain. I mean, he's American, but huge, huge astronomer, very famous.
Still dead.
In 1961, yeah, he's still dead. Being famous doesn't stop you from dying. I'm working on it, but... Anyway, in 1961, he published this paper, The Planet Venus, subtitled, Recent Observations Shed Light on the Atmosphere, Surface, and Possible Biology of the Nearest Planet. Again, this was 1961. It was a couple of years later, the Russians actually landed a probe on Venus. Most people don't know this. The Russians are the only ones who do it. It lasted like 5 minutes before it melted. It was supposed to, but that's about all it did. This time we didn't really know a whole lot, and this was one of the first major papers published about Venus. And one of the things he says down in like the last page of this paper is this. After the physical environment has been thoroughly investigated, and if indeed Venus proves to be without life, there will exist the prospect of microbiological planetary engineering. ... An organism is needed which can photosynthesize in the high atmosphere of Venus according to the symbolic equation, chemistry, freeing the oxygen from the water. In time, organisms would be carried to lower atmospheric levels where, because of higher temperatures, they would be roasted, decomposing ideally according to the symbolic equation, chemistry. Basically what this is saying is he wants to have some kind of biological organism which we would seed into the upper atmosphere where temperatures aren't that high. What it would do is it would take the CO2, take water and light, and break it into CH2O, and then the oxygen would float off. You could get oxygen. Those organisms would then fall into the lower parts of the atmosphere, they burn up, and the CH2O plus the heat would break it apart, and then it would get carbon back out, which would then just kind of keep falling, and then we would get the H2O back, which, since it's hotter, it would rise back up as a cloud and give us what we needed back to the first equation. So it's this nice little iterative cycle where we're just breaking oxygen out, breaking oxygen out. We actually get something right in anime? Holy crap. What's wrong?
They did the research.
Where's the hydrogen? Venus's atmosphere has like this much hydrogen. None. So trying to do this in an equation where you require hydrogen? So cool idea, but fail. Sorry, Carl, you're cool, but it didn't work. And he actually realized that like a couple of years later in another one of his papers. But so anime did their research, but they stopped 40 years ago in 1961. All right, next topic.